Hi, I'm Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about different systems of government in A-level politics. I'm going to start by having a look at the parts of the specification this video covers, and the key essay questions and 12-mark question you could get asked on this topic in the exam, before first giving you an introduction to different systems of government, and then looking in detail at democratic states, semi-democratic states, non-democratic or autocratic states, rogue states, and failed states, with a lot of case studies for each. The notes you can see on your screen are part of an updated textbook on global politics, the global politics section of the Edexcel A Level Politics specification that you can purchase by following the first link in the description of the Politics Explained website, where you can also purchase loads of the resources to help you in your Politics A Level, including essay plans and 12-marker plans that cover every single part of the course, including global politics, updated textbooks that do exactly the same, and a place to sign up for tutoring or some live revision webinars we're doing before this year's exams if that's something you'd be interested in. Without further ado, let's get into it. So starting off with the parts of specification this video covers, this is the fourth of 5 videos on the channel on the fourth subtopic of global politics, power and developments. We've had a look at polarity already, we've had a look at state power classifications, we'd had a look at hard and soft power. Actually, that was the reverse order of the way they were in. Now we're going to look at the final 2 videos are these different systems of government and the influence of like democracy, the rule of law, and free markets as kind of liberal values. But this one's going to have a look at different systems of government, looking at the characteristics, examples, and consequences of these number of different types of states: democratic, semi-democratic, non-democratic, autocratic, failed states, and rogue states. In terms of the key questions you get asked on this topic in the exam, as I've mentioned in previous videos, all of the questions in bold. You can purchase on the Politics Explained website. We have detailed plans for all of them, the 12 markers and the 30 markers. And if you know all of those well, you should be really well prepared for the exam. Not just because they're likely questions that could come up themselves, but also because if you know all of the content in them, you should be able to adapt to answer almost any question that comes up. In terms of key 12 markers you could get asked on this particular topic, I think it's likely you get asked to kind of examine differences between the different types of government, so democratic and autocratic states, semi-democratic or failed states, semi-democratic and rogue states, for example. So knowing the characteristics and some examples for all of them and their consequences for the global order is going to be really important. And I think that comparison is also going to be the kind of thing that's going to be brought into the 30-mark essay questions as well. So the comparison between the different ones and their implications for global peace and security, for example. So you could write a question: evaluate the view that non-democratic states are the system of government that is the biggest threat to global peace and security. Is a very likely question on this topic. Or evaluate the view that rogue states are a greater threat than failed states. So it could be between 2 different types as well, though I think that's a little bit less likely, as that actually is a really difficult kind of question to find enough content for. Let's start off by having a look at introductions to different systems of governments. So governments around the world are structured in various ways, and the system of government defines how power is organised, distributed, and exercised within a state and within the political system. And it plays a key role not only in shaping the domestic policies of a state, but also their foreign policy and how they act globally. And the systems range from, on one end, fully democratic to completely autocratic on the other side, and as we'll see, there's quite a few variations in between. In global politics, they're often categorized based on the degree of political freedom, citizen participation, and control over governance. They not only define the internal workings of states, but also have big implications, as I mentioned, for global peace, security, and economic cooperation. Starting off then, we're going to have a look at democratic states, which are defined by their commitment to popular sovereignty, where the government is elected by the people and accountable to them. So these states typically feature free elections, a multi-party system, the protection of civil liberties, and the rule of law. And in democracies, political power is decentralized, with checks and balances built into the system through independent institutions such as the judiciary, legislature, and the media, which all challenge the executive, the government. One of the key characteristics is the protection of human rights, which is guaranteed through constitutions and legal frameworks. So citizens enjoy freedom of speech, assembly, and the press, and governments are expected to respect the will of the electorate, and when they get voted out, they have to leave. And this leads to transparency, accountability, and a peaceful transfer of power. So we've got a number of case studies here. I'm not going to go through all of them. The case studies we've got are the United States, India, and South Africa. I'm going to go through only the top two I'll go through, and obviously you can pause the video and look at South Africa as well. So the US is considered kind of the archetype of the modern democratic state, with a system of government based on the principle of federalism, so a strong separation of powers and individual rights. It's had a long history, well, for parts of the population, of course, a long history of democratic governance. And its constitution enshrines checks and balances between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. It has regular elections, not only for the executive, so every 4 years for the president, but also every 2 years for part of Congress, and every 6 years, well, actually every 2 years for every part of Congress. And on the global stage, the US has been a key promoter of democratic values through international institutions, such as the United Nations, also through NATO. This being said, its efforts to promote democracy have been widely criticised for violating state sovereignty, and it's more recently been kind of threatened by domestic events, in particular January 6th attack on the Capitol in 2021, which have highlighted some of the vulnerabilities of it as a democracy, but it's very much still a democracy. India is the world's largest democracy and offers a contrasting example of democratic governance in a very different kind of cultural and socioeconomic context. So since gaining independence in 1947, it's maintained a functioning democratic system with regular elections, a multi-party system, and a free press. But the country's also faced challenges, including corruption, some tensions between different religious and ethnic groups, and economic inequality. It's increasingly influential on the global stage, and its democratic stability is seen as a kind of counterbalance to more authoritarian states in Asia. Actually, we'll look at the final one in South Africa. So South Africa is one of Africa's most prominent democracies and provides a key example of democratic governance in a post-colonial context. Since the end of apartheid in 1994, the country's maintained a functioning multi-party democracy with regular elections, an independent judiciary, and a robust civil society. The African National Congress party has been dominant since the transition to democracy, but opposition parties also participate and are able to freely. Its constitution is considered one of the most progressive in the world, enshrining human rights and protections for all citizens. South Africa does face challenges, though, including high levels of political corruption, economic inequality, and persistent divisions, which do challenge it as a democracy, but it still kind of has remained resilient as a system with regular elections and peaceful transitions of power. So then, how can we think about the consequences of democratic states on the global order? The first key one is democratic peace theory. And this is the general tendency of democracies to avoid war with each other. So according to political scientists Russis and O'Neill, between 1950 and 1990, democratic states were involved in only 12% of all international conflicts, despite representing a significant proportion of the global population. This is a significant contrast to non-democratic states. And this contributes to the argument that democracies contribute to global stability and are more likely to cooperate and resolve tensions and divisions through international organisations and through diplomacy rather than through war. Crucially, NATO also plays a part in that. It's a key military alliance of 31 democratic countries that have come together and kind of acted kind of together militarily and kind of share the same interests. The absence of war between NATO members over the past 75 years is kind of cited as evidence of the strength of democratic peace. Another thing that democracies have done globally is sought to promote human rights and democracy through humanitarian interventions. Have a look at the previous video we've done on humanitarian interventions if you want a bit more detail on this. But a lot of these interventions, military interventions, are driven by the belief that democracy promotes peace, security, and prosperity. So not only these interventions are to protect human rights immediately, they often try and create democracies afterwards, after, for example, achieving regime change effectively. Before looking at those interventions, it's also worth noting, though, that democratic countries have used other means to promote human rights and democracy worldwide, so kind of seeking to use their diplomatic and economic power to pressure regimes that violate international norms. For example, EU sanctions on Myanmar following its military coup in 2021, and on Belarus due to its crackdown on opposition figures. And they've also sought to do so through international organisations. Kind of through the UN, through the UN Security Council, for example, and through development aid. So between 1990 and 2020, the US alone spent over $18 billion on programs aimed at promoting democratic governance abroad. Crucially though, as I mentioned, they've also at times used military interventions with the justification, or some might say the pretense, of promoting democracy and human rights across the world. On the one hand, it can be argued that these are necessary to prevent large-scale human rights abuses, help protect vulnerable populations, and create conditions for lasting peace and potential democracy. That can be seen, for example, in the NATO intervention in Kosovo. On the other hand, though, they've actually been criticised a great deal for causing human rights abuses, undermining state sovereignty, and failing to achieve their desired objectives. Russia and China in particular have criticised the West's promotion of democracy and human rights and interference in the internal affairs of other sovereign nations. Whilst the US-led interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq in particular were justified in part on the grounds of promoting democracy and protecting human rights, but had very little success in doing so. In Afghanistan, the Taliban ultimately returned to power after US intervention of over 20 years, whilst in Iraq, Saddam Hussein's dictatorship was overthrown, but the country then experienced years of instability, violence, whilst the US invasion itself killed an estimated 200,000 Iraqi citizens. So the West and democracies might claim to kind of spread democracy and human rights across the globe, but it can actually be argued that they actually do a lot more damage and aren't effective at doing so, especially as the United States itself has been criticised for failing to prevent human rights abuses itself, especially those conducted by its allies and themselves. So you have to look at Guantanamo Bay, for example. There's been significant human rights abuses conducted by US troops, but also it's continued to send arms to Israel throughout the Israeli-Gaza war, despite deaths of over 45,000 civilians and widespread reported human rights abuses. So it's really kind of highlight what some would call the hypocrisy of the United States. And the final then implication for global politics of democratic states is economic globalization and trade. They're often the leaders, democracies, in promoting free trade and economic globalization, especially the United States and the EU, which are both major players in the WTO and both have a significant share of global trade. And the promotion of free trade and free market capitalism in particular has been criticised though, so it can be, on the one hand, be seen as positive because it's promoted free trade globally, including to many countries, and they've been able to kind of improve their economic growth as a result. But on the other hand, this kind of spreading promotion of free market capitalism has been criticised for damaging certain developing countries' economies due to kind of often the failure of free market capitalism, especially those promoted by the IMF and the World Bank through structural adjustment programs in the 1980s and 90s. Have a look at the IMF and World Bank video for much more detail on that. Okay, what we're going to have a look at now is semi-democratic states and their political systems that exhibit both democratic and autocratic features. So they may hold regular elections and have some degree of political pluralism with different parties, but the democratic institutions have often been weakened by a lack of transparency, manipulation by leaders of electoral processes so that they're more likely to win, and their leaders have also restricted civil liberties. They typically maintain power, leaders in semi-democratic states, through a combination of democratic legitimacy but also authoritarian practices where they really fix elections effectively. And they do so by suppressing opposition, controlling the media, and sometimes curbing judicial independence. So they have kind of limited political competition, media censorship, and very weak rule of law a lot of the time. And power frequently remains really concentrated in the hands of a dominant leader or party, with democratic processes more serving as a facade for what's reality more authoritarian control, but it's not complete authoritarianism or autocracy, for example. So then, what are the consequences for the global order? I thought I'd kind of really demonstrate this really through the case studies of Turkey and Hungary. You can see President Erdogan and Viktor Orban there, the presidents of those countries, respectively, to kind of demonstrate this. But so as the case studies are going to illustrate, semi-democratic states pose a real conundrum for international governmental organisations and democracies, as they're often actually able to get the best of both worlds, especially if they're geopolitically significant, like Turkey. So they engage in IGOs and supranational institutions such as the European Union, and are often still able to receive some benefits of being a democracy, as the state is unclear and they still claim to be democracies. For example, the World Bank and IMF frequently offer financial support for semi-democratic states, but these organisations often attach conditions related to governance reforms and transparency. And semi-democratic governments may implement superficial reforms to meet these requirements, but in reality, the real democratic change is limited, and the leaders maintain their control, or they might maintain being the benefits of being a member of the European Union, which we're going to look at for Hungary in particular. And crucially, one of the differences they make is they're building relationships and alliances in the international order with both democratic and authoritarian states, and can benefit these from these alliances and kind of balance them quite effectively to really benefit them as states. So quite a kind of interesting case in the international community and global politics, and if managed correctly and effectively, which they often are, I'd argue by Turkey in particular, they're often able to draw significant benefits. So Turkey really exemplifies a semi-democratic state. Historically, it's been a multi-party democratic system with regular elections and civil liberties enshrined in its constitution. But under the leadership of Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his Justice and Development Party, the AKP, the country's really experienced increasing authoritarianism. Elections continue to be held, but there have been numerous allegations of electoral manipulations, media censorship, and suppression of political opponents. And Turkey's relationship with international organisations reflect its semi-democratic status. As a member of NATO and a candidate for EU membership, it's long been seen as a key democratic ally of the West in the region. But its recent shift to being a kind of semi-democratic, more authoritarian state have strained relations with the EU, which has criticised Turkey's human rights record and its crackdown on political dissent. And as it's become more authoritarian, it's actually also built alliances with Russia and other non-democratic states, showing how they can kind of be in between democratic and authoritarian alliances. Despite these tensions, though, Turkey plays a significant role in international diplomacy, particularly in negotiations related to regional conflicts in Syria and the broader Middle East, and gets a lot of money for the European Union, particularly due to restricting migration to the European Union. So it can still get benefits from these international organisations despite not being a democracy. Hungary is another really good example of a semi-democratic state, especially within the EU. So under Orban, Hungary shifted from being a fully democratic state to a kind of illiberal semi-democratic state. Hungary holds regular elections and maintains many democratic institutions, but Orban's government is kind of really systematically behind the scenes undermined judicial independence, restricted media freedom, and curtailed power through civil society organisations. And as a result, the electoral system is heavily kind of skewed in favour of Orban and his ruling Fidesz party. All the while, though, it claims to still be a democracy. Orban very much claims that Hungary is a democracy, and he's simply been there for so long because he's been democratically elected and has strong popular support. Its status as a semi-democratic state has really created a lot of tensions within the EU as an organisation founded on and democratic principles, and that really promotes the rule of law and democratic principles, especially as Orban's also often praised Trump's nationalism and built ties with both Russia and China, exactly the same as Turkey, showing how semi-democratic states often kind of bridge the alliances between democratic and non-democratic states. The EU has taken steps to address the democratic backsliding, including sanctioning it, especially for its restrictions on the rule of law and judicial independence. But Orban's government has resisted pressure from the EU, and it's ultimately still a member of the EU and gets the economic benefits of being within the EU. And through its economic funding, access to the kind of the single market and trade agreements. And this kind of shows how they're able to maintain membership in international organisations by claiming to be democracies and not explicitly being autocracies, while simultaneously actually in reality challenging the democratic norms. And it shows the difficulties that international governmental organisations face when trying to hold semi-democratic member states to account, whilst preserving unity within the organisation. You effectively can't do both. And as a result, semi-democratic states have often exploited that and been able to be very successful. Okay, continuing along the spectrum then, we have non-democratic or autocratic states. And crucially, they're political systems where power is concentrated in the hands of one leader or ruling group. Elections, if they do occur, are completely manipulated to maintain control, or they may not be held at all. The government often controls or heavily censors the media, limiting freedom of expression and suppressing civil society organisations and other political parties. These other political parties and political opponents are frequently silenced, imprisoned, or exiled, and the rule of law is very weak, the judiciary controlled or influenced by the ruling elite. Autocratic states are a specific type of non-democratic state where governance is dominated by one person, whilst non-democratic is a broader category that includes various forms of authoritarianism, including autocracies, military regimes, and other non-democratic states. Though sometimes autocracy, they're kind of sometimes used as authoritarianism. They're kind of used interchangeably to describe kind of real non-democratic states. So then, what consequences do they have for the international order? The first key consequence is instability and conflict. So many autocratic states face actually domestic instability due to the fact that they're repressive, there's a lack of political participation, and that can sometimes lead to political violence and the population really rising up against the leader which is dominating them. For example, during the Arab Spring of 2011, popular discontent with a number of autocratic regimes across the Middle East and North Africa exploded into widespread revolts, particularly in states like Libya and Egypt, which led to significant political instability and the downfall of some of these autocratic regimes, which can lead to power vacuums and really influence the regions, creating greater instability. So autocratic regimes are also much more likely to experience violent regime changes rather than peaceful transition of power, such as coups or revolutions. Because the lack of legal avenues for political change through elections and peaceful transitions of power, for example, leads to them having to occur by force, and therefore greater conflict, greater violence, and greater political instability. They've also caused global tensions and human rights violations. They're often sources of tension in the international community, particularly when it comes to human rights and military aggression, which they don't respect human rights in comparison to democratic states, and are more likely to be aggressive militarily as they prioritize their own security and survival, especially their leaders, over international norms. For example, in North Korea and Syria, there's been severe repression, political imprisonment, which have drawn widespread condemnation from the global community. And you also look at some countries such as Iran, such as Russia, asserting themselves militarily as well. And these can really destabilize entire regions, as seen by Russia's kind of invasion of Ukraine, annexation of Crimea, and you can also point to a number of other examples in that as well. For example, Iran's intervention in Syria, for example, which kind of really furthered and fueled the civil war. Crucially, another kind of feature and influence consequence of non-democratic states is that they often form alliances with each other to undermine the influence of democracies. For example, strong alliances between China, Russia, and Iran to try and undermine the dominance of democracies such as the United States and the European Union in the global order. So we've got a number of case studies here: Belarus, Saudi Arabia, and China. Feel free to pause and have a look at Belarus, but I'm just going to have a look at the final two, Saudi Arabia and China. So Saudi Arabia is an example of an autocratic monarchy where political power is concentrated in the hands of the ruling royal family. So King Salman and Crown Prince, in particular Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who hold absolute authority with no political parties or elections permitted. The government controls key aspects of society, including the media, judiciary, and religious institutions, and the royal family uses its religious legitimacy and vast oil wealth to maintain power and really repress political dissent. While it sought to modernise aspects of its economy and society, it continues to face severe criticism for its human rights record. The kind of brutal killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018 by Saudi agents within, I think, Turkey highlighted the regime's brutal approach to suppressing dissent. However, despite its autocratic nature, Saudi Arabia plays a critical role in the global order due to its influence in global energy markets. And it's actually because the significance of its power as a big energy power, it's actually built strategic alliances even with democracies in the United States, which really relies on it as the other world's biggest energy producers, Russia and Iran, are opposed to its interests. Another key case study of a non-democratic state is China, which is the most powerful non-democratic state in the world, governed by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, under a one-party system since 1949. Power in China is highly centralized, with President Xi holding multiple leadership roles, including General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, so he's head of the party, Chairman of the Central Military Commission, so he's head of the People's Liberation Army, head of the military as well, and he's of course kind of president of the bureaucracy and of China as a whole. While China holds elections for local bodies, they're tightly controlled, and the CCP is the only party, the Chinese Communist Party. China's economic rise has made it a global superpower, as we looked at in the previous two videos. Its governance model poses challenges to international norms. Human rights abuses, such as the repression of Uyghur Muslims, suppression of pro-democracy movements in Hong Kong, and censorship of the media have drawn significant international criticism. It still plays a significant role in international organisations, have been assertive as a non-democratic state in the international order, including through the Belt and Road Initiative, and quite an assertive policy, foreign policy in the South China Sea, which has caused tensions due to its building of artificial islands. That was non-democratic states. What we're going to have a look at now is a specific form of non-democratic states, and that's rogue states. So the term rogue state was popularized by the United States in the 90s, particularly under Clinton, to describe nations that were seen as real threats to global peace and security and to the US's dominance, due to their defiance of international norms. So these states are kind of defined by engaging in aggressive and unpredictable behavior, such as pursuing weapons of mass destruction, supporting terrorism, or violating international treaties. They're often ruled by authoritarian regimes, they all are actually, that disregard the rule of law and engage in human rights abuses, repression of political opposition, and state-sponsored violence. It's worth noting that the designation of a rogue state is highly subjective and often reflects the kind of foreign policy priorities and views of the United States in particular, though. So what one nation might consider a rogue state, others may view as a strategic ally, making it kind of quite a controversial term in international relations. So, in terms of consequences for the international order, firstly, they create regional and global instability. So they can destabilize entire regions by engaging in military aggression, supporting insurgents, or exporting terrorism. And their actions often provoke military responses from neighbouring countries or international coalitions. You can look, for example, at North Korea, which repeated missile tests in relation to nuclear weapons and an attempt to develop weapons of mass destruction have prompted neighbouring South Korea and Japan to increase their military spending and engage more deeply with the United States. So the aggressive behaviour of rogue states often lead to heightened tensions in already volatile regions. Many try to acquire, develop weapons of mass destruction, which of course often leads to an international response. You look at North Korea, you look at Iran as examples of that, and they crucially also challenge international organisations and the authority and legitimacy of them, particularly when these bodies attempt to hold them accountable for their actions. So in the United Nations, rogue states disregard Security Council resolutions aimed at curbing their aggression or human rights violations. For example, North Korea and Iran are other also really good examples of this, that repeatedly defied US sanctions and resolutions aimed at limiting their nuclear programs. And the presence of rogue states also complicates the work of international organisations like the UN and the ICC, as they often refuse to cooperate with international investigations into war crimes or human rights abuses. Syria, for example, ignored multiple international efforts to hold it accountable for its use of chemical weapons during the civil war. And the ability of rogue states to resist international pressure through alliances with other non-democratic powers or manipulation of global institutions weakens the effectiveness of these organisations in maintaining global peace and security. For example, veto powers held by Russia and China in the UN are often prevent collective action against rogue enemies, which kind of Russia and China have some alliances with, particularly Syria, or when it was under Assad, Syria, North Korea, and Iran. So, got a few case studies here. North Korea, Russia, and Iran. Let's have a look at all of them. So starting off with North Korea. So North Korea under the Kim dynasty is one of the most isolated, infamous rogue states in the world. It's consistently defied international norms. It's effectively an autocracy. It's a communist state. It's especially defied international norms for its nuclear weapons program, which is really sought to develop, despite condemnation from South Korea, the United Nations, the United States. Domestically, there's extreme political repression, including forced labour camps, public executions, and near total control of information. And its aggressive military posturing, such as frequent missile tests, has escalated tensions with neighbouring South Korea, Japan, and also the United States. Russia, of course, an autocracy, can also be seen as a rogue state. It kind of has a very aggressive foreign policy and disregard for international norms. It does hold elections. Its political system is really dominated by Putin, with opposition figures frequently harassed, imprisoned, killed or exiled, as seen by the treatment of Alexei Navalny, who was poisoned and later imprisoned, dying there in 2024. And it's really kind of been very aggressive militarily on the global stage, not only itself through interventions, invasions of Ukraine, in Georgia, in Crimea in 2014, but also through the Wagner Group, which is a Russian paramilitary organization that's been accused of war crimes and has kind of had significant activities in Africa and the Middle East, supporting certain groups on either sides of conflict and really projecting that Russian power, but also creating global instability. Iran's also regarded as a rogue state due to its defiance of international law, its nuclear program, and support for militant groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. Despite its membership in international organizations such as the UN, it's consistently pursued policies that challenge global norms, such as the development of nuclear technology, and also severe kind of aggression involvement in regional conflicts, such as supporting Bashar al-Assad during the Syrian civil war, and also supporting insurgent groups, the Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and that's really contributed to the destabilization of the Middle East in the past decade. That's rogue states. The final group we're going to have a look at then is failed states. And a failed state is a country where the government has lost its ability to perform basic functions necessary for maintaining law and order, protecting its citizens, and providing essential services. So institutions are weak or non-existent, and there's a collapse of governance. And they often experience widespread corruption, chronic violence, economic collapse, and civil war. Like rogue state, though, it's important to recognise that the term failed state has really been popularised and used primarily in the United States, which it's used as justification for interventions, including in the 1990s, for example, in Somalia. And there are concerns that its use actually homogenises African states in particular as all being failed and fails to understand the internal political dynamics and real reasons, and simply presents them as beyond recovery. In terms of their consequences for the global order, the first is regional instability and complex spillover. So when there's internal collapse, there can be real consequences for neighbouring states, including refugee flows, arms trafficking, and the spread of militant and terrorist groups that can destabilise entire regions. For example, the collapse of Somalia in the 90s and the ongoing stability there has led to widespread piracy in the Gulf of Aden, and disrupting international shipping lanes and prompting military interventions, while we saw huge refugee flows resulting from the Syrian civil war. They're often breeding grounds for terrorism and crime, as the absence of a functioning government allows these groups to operate kind of without impunity, recruiting fighters, smuggling weapons, and launching attacks both domestically and internationally. Afghanistan under the Taliban prior to 2001 became a base, for example, for Al-Qaeda, which used the country to plan and execute the September the 11th 9/11 attacks. In more recent times, Somalia and Libya have become breeding grounds for terrorist organisations like Al-Shabaab and ISIS. And the international community often intervenes in failed states to try and combat this terrorism, as seen in NATO's involvement in Afghanistan after 9/11. Failed states are also often sites of severe humanitarian crises, with mass displacement, famine, and widespread disease posing significant threats to their populations. And that often leads to humanitarian interventions that can become long-term commitments, particularly if the government isn't rebuilt and there aren't effective institutions there. A couple of case studies then. You've got Somalia, Yemen, and Sudan. So starting with Somalia, it's often cited as one of the kind of most prominent examples of a failed state since the overthrow of its central government in 1991, where it's really lacked a functioning national authority. The power is quite fragmented among certain regional warlords, militias, and insurgent groups like Al-Shabaab, and for over 2 decades it was plagued by civil war, famine, and lawlessness, with the government only controlling parts of the capital, Mogadishu. And this, of course, led to piracy flourishing off the Somali coast, as I mentioned. International efforts to stabilise Somalia, including peacekeeping missions by the African Union, had some limited success, but there are ongoing insurgencies, corruption, and clan-based conflicts, which have kind of meant that Somalia remains one of the world's most fragile states, with persistent violence, underdevelopment, and humanitarian crisis that affects millions of citizens. Yemen has descended into a failed state after years of civil war, economic collapse, and humanitarian catastrophe. It's a conflict between the Houthi rebels, which overthrew the government in 2015, has resulted in real fragmentation in the country, with multiple factions controlling different regions, and the fact that it's kind of become a proxy conflict between the Yemeni government, which is backed by the Saudis, and the Houthis, which are backed by Iran. Civil wars really devastated Yemen's infrastructure, left millions displaced, and triggered widespread famine. And the United Nations, has called Yemen the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with millions of people in urgent need of food, healthcare, and essential services. And the country's instability poses significant security risks in the region and has prompted ongoing international interventions, particularly from Saudi Arabia and Iran, which have further complicated the conflict. Finally, final case study we're going to look at is Sudan, which has faced significant instability since the overthrow of Omar al-Bashir in 2019. There was then a power-sharing agreement between civilian and military leaders, which kind of offered hope for a democratic transition. But this fragile arrangement, which is often kind of organised and by Western powers, really failed to recognise the real nature of politics in Sudan, and was collapsed in October 2021 when the military staged a coup. This was met with mass protests, which were violently suppressed, and then eventually in April 2023, a civil war began, with breakout in fighting between the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, led by rival military leaders. It's devastated large parts of the country, including the capital Khartoum, and displaced millions of people, and the violence continues today. International efforts to broker peace have struggled to gain traction, and it remains in a state of collapse, unable to provide basic services to the population as it's in a state of civil war. More than 5 million people have been displaced, and millions more are in urgent need of food, water, and medical assistance. And it's strained neighbouring countries like Chad and South Sudan, which are struggling to manage and maintain the influx of refugees fleeing the country. So yeah, that was a video going through the different systems of government. We looked, of course, at democratic states, semi-democratic states, autocracies, rogue states, and failed states. And crucially, what you need to look at is not just the characteristics of those states, but also their consequences for global peace and the global order. Please let me know if you've got any questions or comments in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next video.